Arnar, thanks for jumping on to record a podcast with me today. I'm excited to talk about ventilation, how athletes can apply it for performance, and the Vital Pro device, which I have right here that I've been using for several months. You all sent me one. I've been having a lot of fun playing around with the data, looking at ventilation and terms of exercise when I'm running and biking. But before we get into some questions and talk about ventilation, how athletes can use it for performance, could you just give people bit of an introduction to yourself and a little bit of your background?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So my name is Arnar Larusson, originally from Iceland, backgrounds in mechanical engineering. And I got into this space really through developing prosthetics for amputee athletes, and exosuits for the U.S. military. And during those projects, we were always looking at metabolic output and efficiency. Uh, so in order to assess whether the devices were actually doing what they were supposed to be doing, we strapped face masks to people's faces and measured their breathing. And that was really my first introduction to breathing as something to be measured, something that could give insight into, yeah, how hard we're working. And it struck me really as this gap that existed between the stuff that we have available out in the field, in terms of what we can measure to understand our internal workload, how hard we're working, the efficiency, what our fitness level is, versus what we can actually know in the lab. And that gap was just, when you see what we can see in the lab, it's night and day difference. And the central component there that we have in the lab are things like breathing, lactate, that really paint a much richer picture than heart rate, pace, or power do on their own. So that was the gap that I saw, and kind of was my initial aha. Well, why can't we do this out in the field? And that would provide a lot of benefit to understanding training and fitness level, and how we should go about our training with respect to what our personal fitness levels are. And so yeah, that was kind of my introduction and how we got started with Timewear.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so, obviously, I guess to give a brief overview of what we're talking about for the audience today. So, we're talking about the Vital Pro device, which I have right here. I think I already showed it, but it's a heart rate monitor, but it also has this breathing sensor on the back. And I'll probably ask you, Arnar, to sort of describe how all of that maybe works a little bit soon. But so it can measure your heart rate and your ventilation rate, your respiratory rate at the same time. And it does provide a lot of valuable information. So I guess my first question is, why ventilation? Why is it so useful? What is this metric that most people, if not, I think a majority of athletes certainly aren't measuring? So, make a case for why measuring ventilation is actually important during exercise. Why is it better than some of these more traditional metrics that every athlete's using, essentially heart rate? Why is it probably better than that? Make the case to me for that.
Well, it is what we're actually trying to measure. And if you go into a lab, and you can go back decades, and what were we doing in the lab to understand internal workload? We were strapping face masks to people's faces and measuring their breathing. So it is the central thing that we really care about when we are trying to understand fitness level, how someone should train, what their internal workload is. That is how we measure it. When it gets to heart rate, pace, and power, those are not direct measurements, but they are proxies to understand that sort of central thing that we care about. And so heart rate, for example, correlates really nicely with oxygen consumption, but, and it's a big but, it's it has these confounding factors of it's really sensitive to heat, external stressors that are not related to the internal workload. It changes with fitness, which is actually a benefit. Like, we want to see that, but that also makes it hard to use as a ground truth to understand how hard am I actually working, because the cardiovascular system is sort of in flux and changing and improving over time as you gain fitness, or degrading as you lose it. Breathing is a much more foundational thing. It changes almost not at all. In terms of, as you gain fitness, your breathing doesn't really change in terms of the capacity to breathe. What changes is the underlying muscles are improving, and that changes how your breathing responds. So the way I can kind of unpack that is breathing is overbuilt for purpose structurally, right? So they're very for the vast majority of people, your breathing muscles don't change much. Your lungs don't change with fitness, and that's actually a good thing because it's not changing. It's this ground truth that we can rely on to understand how hard we're actually working. The cardiovascular system does change, and we want it to change. We want more vasculature. We want those capillaries to build out into our muscles to pump more oxygen and into our muscles. That's all good, but it also changes the heart rate connection to the workload, and not to mention when we have dehydration or heat stress and things like that, we have these external factors on the heart rate system that don't impact the breathing system. And so the way that the breathing system works is that as we breathe in and out, what we're really doing is we're servicing the muscles. We're breathing in oxygen and we're breathing out the CO2 that the muscles are both. So oxygen consumption of the muscles, and then because of how efficient the muscles are producing the work, they're going to be creating in variable amounts of CO2. The less efficient that muscle is working, the more CO2 that needs to then get breathed out, right? So the breathing function is really just servicing the muscles of the body in order to bring in oxygen and evacuate the CO2 byproduct that results from the work that the muscles do. So from that lens, breathing is a very interesting metric because it gives us this lens into the working muscle that almost no other metric can, and it's stable over time, right? Because it's not changing over time, and so it becomes this reflection of the internal working of the muscle and its efficiency, and that is fundamentally how we define fitness, right? So fitness is just how much work can you do? How long can you sustain it? And the fitter you are, the longer you can go, the faster you can go for longer. It's really that simple. And so when we have breathing in the loop, a lot of these other metrics like heart rate, pace, power, they become actually even more interesting because with that foundation of knowing where the ventilation is at each of your zones, so defining your training zones based on ventilation, it allows you to see how the heart rate changes and responds to over time in improving fitness, how it might respond to the changing of the seasons as we go from cold to hot or hot to cold. It shows us it gives us context for effects of potential dehydration, underfueling, all these things that the heart rate is trying to tell us that we have a really hard time backing out into, let's say we have a really hard time analyzing or assessing what it is trying to say without some kind of benchmark off of which to work from. How hard was I really working? Okay, heart rate was higher. That means I was probably underfueled a little bit, or I was a little bit dehydrated. Or we can look at the temperature and correlate that to, oh, it was actually hotter that day. That therefore heart rate was drifting a little bit more at the end of the workout. My fueling was okay. I know it was on point. My hydration was fine. I know it was fine. It was the temperature, right? So without a ground truth to kind of rely on, it's really hard to say what these other systems are telling us.
Right. So I guess, if I'm picking up what you're putting down, it's essentially like a direct measure of metabolic power output that is not influenced by all these, maybe not influenced, but not influenced as substantially by all of these confounding factors, essentially, like you mentioned, heat, underfueling. Those are all going to inevitably impact like heart rate, but respiratory rate ventilation seems to be less sensitive to some of those confounding factors.
Exactly. And to the extent that it is sensitive to things like heat, that is in fact because you are spending more energy to cool down. So
Yep.
I think I think there I don't quote me on this. I don't exactly I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's for every degree of temperature, there's about a 10% increase in energy demand increase. Core for every 1 degree of core body temperature increase, there's about a 10% increase in energy demand. That's internal workload. So you are in fact working harder, and therefore you do
Mm.
need to breathe more. But the heart rate doesn't respond in that same way. It responds because it's pushing all that blood to other uses other than fueling your muscles, right? It's using blood to cool you, and so it has this sort of confounding factor of it's not just pushing stuff to the muscles; it's also putting it out into the capillaries and on your skin to increase that sort of that thermal load through the body and out into the skin, out through the skin.
Yeah,
So
and this is actually kind of a key. This is a discussion I get into all the time, and maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit. But since we're on the topic, I live in Texas. Over the summer, it gets very hot. I mean, it gets hot a lot of places in the United States over the summer. But there's sort of this argument that you need to modify your pace to sort of stay in this zone two heart rate based on the heat. And my argument has always kind of been, well, I might actually want to force this pace because if I'm really trying to stay at my zone two heart rate in the heat and humidity, I would have to slow down almost to a pace that to me seems unbearable. And so there's kind of this disconnect between, well, maybe I'm at a zone three heart rate, but I'm at a zone two pace. So what I found with using like this ventilation sensor over the summer has been, well, I can stay in this zone two sort of metabolic intensity even when it's hot. My heart rate might be a little bit elevated, but I'm going to pay more attention to ventilation than I would my heart rate because I don't want to say artificially elevated, but it is artificially elevated because it's trying to cool my body down. So, ventilation becomes much more valuable then, especially in places like the heat where I don't feel like I should force my pace to go slower just to accommodate this heart rate when, like you mentioned, it's confounded by all these other factors.
exactly, and and the same goes for when you're less fit
Hmm.
and your cardiovascular system just hasn't gained the fitness yet. So you're sort of you're in this in between where like the ventilation will still show you your internal workload, but your heart rate's just going to go off and drift, or it's going to be artificially higher than it was when you were a little bit more fit, and then it's going to start coming down. Like all of that is signal that is really hard to understand if you don't have that foundation of like what is my actual internal workload, and that's what we get from breathing. The same example we get from we have users on the extreme side of like, people that live in Singapore, for example. They have, they go out, they do their testing. These are professional triathletes that train out there. And they do their lab testing in controlled environments. They dial in all their numbers, and then they go out into, 70% humidity
Hmm.
and 40 C, which is like 110 Fahrenheit or something like that. And those numbers just go out the window, both the heart rate and the power. So whereas the ventilation allows them to pace it appropriately, so they let the heart rate go up. They let the power drop because also importantly is that because you're in the heat, for instance, because you're working harder to cool yourself down, you're expending more energy to cool yourself down or keep
Hmm.
yourself maintain body temperature. Um, that is subtracting from the pace that you should be doing. Add that to durability, right? So you're doing a 5 hour ride in those conditions. You absolutely should not be doing the same pace or power at the beginning versus at the end, right? You're fatiguing those muscles, and so your effective threshold, your effective internal workload is shifting. It's changing because of that fatigue. It's getting a little bit worse, right? So your pace at a threshold is going to drop over time. And of course, the fitter, more durable we are, the less it drops. And we see this across the spectrum where you have, guys at the world tour level in cycling where, they're doing the Tour de France. The guys that win are the ones that drop off the least, and so forth. So, there's a spectrum to this, and it's very individual. And sort of knowing all these, well, I guess the fundamental things that breathing allows us to understand all these things just so much better. Yeah.
Yeah. So what exactly are we measuring with this device? I think, there are lots of metrics when I open the app and I'm using it during my workout. I have minute ventilation, tidal volume, breathing rate. So can you explain maybe the differences between all of those? And, are they telling us sort of the same thing about physiology and what's happening during exercise and maybe fatigue, or are they each of those things telling a little bit different of a story?
Yeah, so breathing is made up of two components: the rate at which you breathe and the volume per breath. It's called tidal volume. So breathing rate and tidal volume. Those together, when we multiply them together, create what's called minute ventilation. That's the airflow in and out of the lungs over time. And uh, in terms of guiding pace and guiding internal workload, that minute ventilation component is the one to go by, because um, you can be you can be breathing fast with low depth. You can be breathing slow with high depth, but you can be at the same minute ventilation. And this is what happens with breathing. Oh, sorry, I just got something open here.
Oh, good.
Uh, sorry, something just popped up on my window here. Um, yeah, you can be breathing at the same minute ventilation for a different breathing rate and a different tidal volume. And we see this across people, within a person, across workouts. And so what's happening there is the minute ventilation is the representation of what the muscles are doing. So it is servicing how much oxygen you need, how much CO2 you need to go out. No matter what, that demand will be met, independent of how you breathe or how you accomplish that. Um, the breathing rate component of minute ventilation uh, is is uh, 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 is dominated by a central command, and that's where breathing gets really interesting, is because it's kind of a two-for signal, where you have the overall ventilation is servicing the muscles and what they need. But then the breathing rate side of this is really tied to perceived exertion or neuromuscular fatigue. So the harder something feels, or the more sort of signal you need to push down into your body to like maintain a pace, that impacts the breathing rate. And you can start to see that the ventilation might be staying steady, but breathing rate starts to climb as the perception of the effort, the neuromuscular um, um, load or fatigue of the effort increases. And in order to maintain that ventilation, you'll actually see tidal volume dropping. And so it's those are really the two components that I say to kind of pay most attention to, is the minute ventilation for the internal workload. Think of that as kind of like your power on a bike, your pace
Mhm.
on the run. That's the thing you're going by to pace the effort. And then the breathing rate component is a separate indicator of how stressful, how much how hard am I working at the same internal workload. And that's a signal that can be very useful for heat training, durability training, and things like that. So yeah, for coaches to understand an athlete, they're maintaining a good pace, but then they're starting to work harder towards the end. That's great signal. That is sort of an independent signal of the work, of the perception of that workload. And then, of course, talking to the athlete, understanding how you feel and so forth, and starting to connect the dots in that creates a really useful tool to sort of benchmark and understand that sort of connection between perception of the effort itself, and so forth. So it's a great tool for pros and novices alike that are just trying to take their first steps in understanding their own physiology and their own body and how it's responding to fitness. Or if you're further along and you're really stress testing those things and under using it to dial in certain workouts to prep for a certain race or conditions.
Yeah. So the breathing rate, does that how does that relate to ventilatory threshold? So we often hear VT1, VT2 when we're talking about physiology zones, intensities. Is VT1? Can you explain to the audience what VT1 is and what VT2 are and how those relate to the metrics that you were just talking about? So breathing rate, tidal volume.
Yeah, so VT1 and VT2 are your ventilatory thresholds. They're corollary to your lactate thresholds, LT1, LT2. I say, just to kind of give a brief explainer on that, it's they spring from the same source, right? So ventilatory threshold 1 and 2 are driven by CO2 production, which is from burning carbohydrates in the muscle. Lactate is created in from that same source. Um, uh, Carbohydrates are broken down into pyruvate. Pyruvate attaches to the hydrogen ion, and you have a lactate molecule. So as we break down carbohydrates, we produce CO2, we produce lactate. Of course, lactate a metabolite, something that we can actually use as a fuel, and so it has slightly different dynamics, and so it's a little bit slower to respond in many cases, or harder to discern LT1 in a shorter time frame because of that sort of consumption dynamic, whereas VT1 being driven by CO2, something that gets evacuated quite quickly, is something that can be exposed much more readily. So VT1 is really that transition. And traditionally, it's your top of zone two. So zone two training is defined by the ceiling of zone two training is your VT1. It is marked by the decrease in fat oxidation and the increase in carbohydrate oxidation. So you have this sort of transition in your muscles where the muscle starts to prefer carbohydrates over fat in order to produce the energy that it needs. And VT2 is basically the end of that process where you are now practically no longer consuming fat and almost entirely carbohydrate dependent. It is so VT1 would be your aerobic threshold, VT2 would be your anaerobic threshold. Those names are imperfect, but
Yep.
kind of how I describe them is what's underlying that. And why they're important is because they are the fundamental definition of your training zones. So all the training zones that we work off of are at their core trying to assess these two markers, right? So FTP on the bike is really backing into a VT2 estimate. Um, there's there's really no good way to back into a VT1 reliably without measuring it. You have things like the talk test, but yeah, it's just there's so much variability in how people can talk at different levels that it becomes very difficult to use that. Um, Percentages of FTP, heart rate max, VO2 max, that has pretty much been debunked for the last 40 years. Through just very large studies that have shown that if you are doing any kind of percentage based off of a single metric, your variability at assessing VT1 is going to be around 30%, which means that you could think that you're in your estimated VT1 or zone 2, but actually be somewhere between zone 1 and zone 4. And So that variability is just huge and just underlines the individual nature of this measurement or this physiological phenomenon that we have. Not to mention that it's in flux, right? So your percentage of any max, like the day-to-day variability of VO2 max is like, I think like between 5 and 10%.
Yep.
Heart rate variability is day-to-day can be 20, 30 beats or very, very large depending on the heat and conditions and so forth. So measuring VT1 and measuring VT2 is fundamental to defining your training zones, and ventilation gives us a stable metric to target them, know where we are with respect to them. And so what our users, for example, describe is going from like an FTP world or percentage of heart rate world to a world where they can know where their VT1, VT2 are and target them, is from a world where they are plateauing because they're not identifying their correct training zones, they're not targeting them correctly, to all of a sudden seeing 40-watt increases in terms of biking and cycling, 40-watt increases in their FTP, something that hadn't budged for months or years. In a marathon, allowing yourself to be passed in the first half and then winning your age group because you paced it correctly based on your VT1 and VT2, and passing everyone on the back end. So those are the kind of the wins that our users are having, both in terms of improved fitness and race results, when this information is readily available to them in their training. And so I don't know where you want to kind of go with.
Yeah, maybe some practical applications, but I guess before we move on from that, so like what exactly is going on for maybe people who aren't familiar with like the ventilatory thresholds? What's going on there? So what's actually happening at those two inflection points? Is it just an increase in breathing rate?
Well, so breathing rate is pretty much independent for the most part. It's really the minute ventilation that's responding, and so the minute ventilation, what it does, so the total airflow is it's servicing that oxygen in, that CO2 out. As your muscles transition, make that transition from starting to downgrade the amount of fat consumption that they're using and increasing that carbohydrate, what happens is that you produce more CO2 that energizes the airflow, the amount of air you need to breathe in and out in order to evacuate that CO2. So really, exercise is actually much more dominated by CO2 exhaust than oxygen intake.
Mhm.
Um, and it's which is kind of like not how most people think about it.
Yeah,
But
no, right. I think there's all this common misconception that if you ask the average person like why do we breathe, it's oh to get oxygen into our muscles, but no, it's really to offload CO2. I think that was like one of the first things I ever when I started studying exercise physiology. It's like you breathe because of CO2, not because of oxygen. You know, hold your breath. It's that burning sensation, isn't your body saying, oh my gosh, we don't have oxygen. It's well,
correct.
you're all this CO2 is building up and you have to get rid of that because it's acidic. Like that's why you feel that burning sensation in your lungs.
Exactly. And as we get more efficient, i.e., as we get more fit, we produce less CO2. And because we're consuming more fat versus carbs, or we're consuming lactate more efficiently, and so we can downregulate how much carbs we end up actually consuming. That produces less CO2. So all that's happening as we get fitter is our muscles are getting more efficient and therefore they're producing less CO2. Therefore, we need to ventilate less at higher outputs. Um, and uh, or ventilate the same at higher outputs. Um, and so the way that the ventilation responds is that as that CO2 is being produced in the muscle, it energizes this ventilation response, and it starts to so ventilation is very steady in the low zones. So zone one, zone two, it doesn't move much. And then as you start to get above VT1, it starts to trend upwards. And by the time you get into VT2, it gets into this sort of exponential curve where it's basically just like freaking out, trying to get as much CO2 as it possibly can out of the system because we're so sensitive to that CO2 buildup. And so it has this sort of like corollary to the lactate curve most people are familiar with. Ventilation responds in very much the same way, and they look very similar. Um, uh, Breathing rate on its own will not expose that because of the individual differences in how people breathe. Some people just choose to breathe at a very low rate. Some people it will expose it, right? So that there's a subset of people that it will expose, and that just happens to be how they decide to breathe and accomplish the ventilation demand. Others, you'll see it in the tidal volume. But the ventilation, when you combine those two signals, that's where you always see it. And that's really what we rely on when we detect BT1, BT2.
So there are individual differences maybe in how we achieve that. So I guess my question though is like does the way in which someone achieves that higher minute ventilation tell anything about sort of what's going on physiologically or fatigue? So for instance, if I'm reaching my VT1, I can obviously accomplish that higher minute ventilation by increasing my breathing rate and keeping my tidal volume similar, or I could increase my tidal volume while keeping my breathing rate similar, or I could increase both obviously at the same time. But say is does the physiology of like what's going on, maybe if I'm more fatigued, will I increase it minute ventilation one way versus the other? So if I increase my breathing rate, is that telling me something different than if I increase my minute ventilation by with a higher tidal volume, for instance?
Yeah, there is some stuff in there. I'm careful to say that there's any definitive answer because um, uh, we see we see some of the fittest athletes in the world breathing in ways that like you might think is not efficient.
Hmm.
But they're some of the fittest in the world. So like, it's like, if you're a golfer on the PGA Tour and they have a wonky swing, like, should you actually be changing that?
Right.
Um, Um, but uh, there is some benefit. There's a so breathing. The fundamental there is that breathing costs energy, and and just like any other muscle, our diaphragm is a muscle just like any other. It has strength, coordination, endurance, and we can for sure improve those things, right? It's a trainable muscle, both from a coordination standpoint, so how we breathe, breathing rate, tidal volume, but also how durable it is, right? So if our breathing starts to get fatigued, there's an effect of shunting of blood, from the muscles to the diaphragm to make sure that we can continue to breathe, and so the body has these sort of mechanisms that, through training can be improved, and so there's for sure there. But I think for most people, it's something that just gets solved pretty well on its own, and there might be some marginal gains to be had at the top level, and sort of, if you've ticked all the other boxes, then training this aspect might be beneficial, unless of course you have like a real some real issue, yeah, right? So
Mhm.
some dysfunction, then of course that's a different story. But I think for the average kind of the normal spread of people, like that, this is not the first thing to work on, because the body accomplishes this in the right way, and but what you do see happen is that, for the same internal workload, like we know that the first hour versus the fourth hour, they feel different, even though we might be at the same internal workload, and that shows up in the breathing rate. And the way that it shows up is that the breathing rate will start to increase with that increased perception of effort. Tidal volume will drop to compensate, because again, the muscles are at the same internal workload, so they don't need any more or less than they had before. But that perception of effort is driving that breathing rate response. And so then the tidal volume drops in order to keep that ventilation servicing the muscles in the right way.
Yeah, so I feel like essentially you're describing the concept of durability here, which I think is catching popularity within like the endurance sports world. We talk about durability. I've discussed this before, kind of on my podcast and written about it, but could you maybe define durability a little bit and maybe tell us, you kind of just did, but like what is breathing rate telling us about durability, and how does breathing rate change, as the exercise intensity goes on, and what's happening, I guess, because like if I go out for a 5 hour ride or a run for a couple hours, maintain the same pace, or try to maintain the same pace, I guess, but physiology keeps ticking up. So heart rate goes up, ventilation goes up, what's exactly going on there? And, you know, what should we look at or be concerned with when those metrics are disagreeing? So heart rate may start to rise disproportionately to breathing rate. So, what should we actually focus on maybe during very, very prolonged exercise when our durability is going down?
So they've done some nice studies on this. I'm sure you're familiar with them, down in the guys down in New Zealand, Ed Monders, Dan Plews, and their collaborators. They've done a really nice set of experiments where they brought people into the lab. They tested VT1 fresh. They did 2 hour time trial at 90% of VT1. So that's in your zone two. That's kind of top of your zone two. And then they tested VT1 again after those 2 hours. What they found was that heart rate drifted at VT1. So same workload. So at VT1, heart rate had increased. I think it was like 15 beats, 12, 15 beats on average, something like that. The power output at VT1 had dropped on average 24 watts. The ventilation had stayed the same, right? So we're still at VT1. So the ventilation is still at VT1. Heart rate is now, 12, 15 beats higher. Power is now down 24 watts. So those two signals, heart rate and power, are diverging.
Mhm.
Whereas ventilation is staying consistent with the actual internal workload. So the TLDR there is that ventilation is a much more consistent internal marker of how hard you're working. If you're seeing it drift up because you're maintaining the pace, well, that's exactly what we would expect to see, because you're actually fatiguing to the point where that same pace is no longer at that internal workload, right? You're degrading because of that fatigue. And if you're trying to hold a certain internal workload, which is ultimately what you're trying to do to sort of um, to limit the amount of stress, undue stress that you need on the body because you need to get back at it the next day and the next day and the next day. So that stress starts to build up if you're maintaining the pace, but you're fatiguing um, more than you would otherwise need to, right? So that can be a recipe for disaster down the line of just sort of overtraining syndrome, and so that can be that can be insidious, it should creep up on you. Um, the heart rate increased there, right? So the fact that heart rate is increasing is actually fine. And in fact, if you had dropped to compensate for the dropped your pace only to compensate for the heart rate, you would have been undertraining,
Mhm.
right? So and so but the thing that I find most interesting about that is that one, there was an individual difference in the so that was those were the average results, but there was an individual difference if you looked at each subject. They all drifted and changed in different ways. So some people were more durable than others. Some people dropped 40 watts. Others dropped almost nothing after that 2 hour. Um, and so that goes to show that there are these individual differences in where we are in our fitness, where we are in our training, in our fatigue state, and so forth. That is just really hard to pin down if we only have heart rate and power. And the fact that that ventilation was staying consistent is the thing we need to benchmark to understand. Okay, I'm maintaining 2 hours the pace, same pace for 2 hours. My ventilation is going up. My heart rate's going up because the ventilation was going up. That's actually signal that you're becoming less durable over time. You're fatiguing to the point where you should be dropping the pace. And the fact that the heart rate probably would have still drifted independent of dropping that pace is signal that maybe there was some dehydration, right? You weren't controlling for fueling well enough. That's the signal that you need there, or what that's trying to tell you. So durability is really nothing more than just fatigue over time, and your
Yeah,
ability to produce the internal workload in at the same power, and the mapping between the internal workload and the output is staying consistent. Durability is the degradation of that. It's really nothing more complicated than that. It's just fatigue basically, and your ability to sustain or fatigue less over time.
yeah, it's kind of funny. There's almost like this debate in exercise physiology. Everybody's like, what? We coined this new term durability. Everybody's like, this is just fatigue is like we're just kind of renaming fatigue, but I like the idea of durability or resilience. But I like
But the thing
the
is, it's also like it just wasn't. At least to my knowledge, it hasn't really been described very well. I think
mhm.
that's the main thing, right? It's like, I mean, a name by a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, right? I mean, it's like a name is just a name, but I think the understanding of the underlying mechanism is getting a lot richer now than in the past. I think
I think so
that's
too.
for me, that's the clear thing.
I think so too. And the way that I like to define it is like, well, I mean, this is kind of the definition, but when I'm describing it to people, it's like do a VO2 max test fresh, run for 2 hours, and then do a VO2 max test afterwards. Like, how much does your VO2 max decline or your speed of VO2 max decline before and after that test? And like, that's kind of your durability versus thinking about how you degrade over time, that because people just associate more that with like muscular fatigue. So it's like if you run a 5K and then 90 minutes at like your top of zone 2 and then run another 5K, how durable are you? Can you run the same 5K before and after? Then you're highly durable. If you drop off by a minute or two, then you're probably not that durable. But there's just so many signals going on and so many ways you can measure it. I think that's where it's like confusing. You can measure VT1, as you mentioned. You can measure heart rate. You can measure lactate threshold, 5K time. So just a lot of data going on, which can be messy, can be
Yeah,
great for athletes. I mean, more data isn't necessarily always better, but if you know how to use
true.
it, it
And,
can be.
and yeah, and I think what what we're seeing is the ventilation really simplifies this because we can actually see that degradation. Not, you don't from a simple workout, right? So the mapping of ventilation to these other things is that baseline that has really been missing, and when you don't have that baseline, things are really confusing and hard to understand. But when you have just that simple baseline, then it makes sense that the 20-watt drop that you were seeing is actually the durability degradation, or the 15 beat increase for the same ventilation is actually a signal that something is, whether it's your hydration or your heat stress or something like that. And so uh, and like without that foundation, it's really hard to dissect those other two signals. And that's like that was the initial insight of just being in the lab, was like, well, we don't care about heart rate in the lab. We don't practically we don't care about power in the lab or pace. The only reason we care about those things in the lab is because we want to be able to take the breathing related or the lactate related measurements, and we want to have some context for those things that we could measure in the lab when we bring them out into the field. So we know that power is associated with a certain physiological phenomenon, that a heart rate is associated with a physiological phenomenon. The problem is all these sort of confounding factors of durability and fatigue, how it affects power at the same workload, right? Like that's what they were showing in the New Zealand, the group in New Zealand. The heart rate is drifting because of these external workloads. That's confusing, right? That we need a lot. We need to do a lot of acrobatics to back into something useful when we have something that's like shifting like that. And that's the importance of having something like a metric like breathing that can be kind of your foundation on which to understand how these other metrics are responding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the key takeaway here when I'm thinking about ventilation and how I've been thinking about it as I've started to use this device more myself. It's like and it's the common question where people are always asking me like how to set your zone twos and what percent of heart rate it should be. And as we've kind of just discussed this entire time, these things they're great, but they're proxies for your metabolic power output. They're proxies for ventilation, and they can change so much from day to day that I mean even lactate. I mean even if you were using lactate levels to set your zone twos, from day to day, your lactate levels are going to fluctuate based on stress, based on dietary factors, based on prior training, glycogen
Yes.
levels. So it makes setting your zones based on essentially anything other than this foundation of breathing rate very, very unreliable. Essentially, I mean, when it comes down to it.
100%. Yes. And
Yeah.
and yeah. And I think that what you said there about lactate is underappreciated, which and it's absolutely the case because it is something that is being consumed, and is so linked to fueling state and yeah, stress, and it can pool, and there are all sorts of dynamics to it. It's not something that the body is inherently trying to get rid of, like CO2, which is what makes it such a nice signal to have. It's like we're very sensitive to CO2 needs to get out if we create too much of it. Whereas, you can have someone at, lactate of 12 millimole, standing there and being perfectly fine. In fact, you can pump them like they've done these studies where they inject lactate to increase it, and the person's just standing there that has no effect on them. And so uh, yeah, that's not to mention that we now have like these exogenous lactate and what that's going to be
Yeah.
doing in the fueling world, and the sort of, yeah, super interesting. We know those guys quite well, and but yeah, that's it. It's we're going into an interesting world, I think, with one better understanding of what's going on, uh, um, different fueling mechanisms that are for sure going to see some improvements in performances, and just a better understanding of training overall with measures like this, like what we're seeing at the world tour level with the professional athletes that we work with. When we have ventilation in the loop, we can understand so much more than what we had in the past. And that is just a recipe for improving training, improving race performances, and that's what we're packaging and bringing to as many people as possible to make it accessible to anyone that's trying to improve their fitness.
Yeah, and I would love if you could maybe briefly chat about how, I watched the entire tour that just wrapped up, the Tour de France this year, and, Team Visma Lisa Bike was using the Vital Pro sensors a lot, I know, in their training and potentially even like during the race, I think. So there was a lot of coverage around that, and I thought that was cool because I was using it myself and seeing them use it. So can you talk briefly about how these pro cycling teams are using ventilation? And then I know Tymewear's worked a little bit with athletes from Solomon, so like ultra runners, but how are athletes actually using this in practice? In particular, I think I'm interested in like the cycling because they always tend to be ahead in terms of practice and endurance sports. Runners, we unfortunately like lag behind in the technology, but the cyclists are really kind of leading the charge, I think. So, what are some of the ways in which the team Lisa Bike specifically, but cyclists are using this data in training and racing?
They use it in much the same way that our normal users use it. They set their training zones. They guide certain workouts based on ventilation because they let heart rate drift. They drop their power as durability declines, and ventilation is kind of that normalization metric that they can use to benchmark that intensity that they're supposed to be targeting. And uh, for them, they train in so many different environments, right? They're going up to elevation, they're going down to sea level to race. They're doing heat training, they're doing all the interventions, right? And they're doing a lot of it, right? So these guys are training just, I mean, like it's ungodly amounts of hours that they put in, and the kcals that they put out. And so for them, having that intensity control, that precision in knowing where someone's thresholds are, how to then define their training based on that is a very important input into effective training and building up that durability and not overcooking things because they need to get back at it, in the afternoon or the next day and so forth. So it's really the same principles that any other sort of normal user would be using the metric or the device. I mean, they just put it to the extreme, right? So and uh, yeah, so that's kind of how I would describe their use of it. And it's interesting that you mentioned like the cycling is kind of this is so far ahead, which is true, from a sort of a metric standpoint, from a understanding the workload and how the precision in their training, all these things that we know cycling does today. Everything is measured to the second, and but it wasn't always like that. And in fact, it wasn't until the introduction of the power meter
Hmm.
and the adoption of it in the late '90s that biking or cycling actually became something that was more of a science than an art. Up until that point, it was just pure vibes, and and the power meter completely changed that, right? So and that was the start of cycling going from an art to an art and a science, and I think that the challenge with running is there is no power in running. There's pace, but that's that gets interfered with the terrain that we're running on. And so if you go to a track, like everything is by the second. You're doing
Hmm.
a lap in these many seconds, and that's and the whole training paradigm is just based around track times, and that's great for a track, but it's terrible for as soon as you get on a trail or with any kind of terrain or and so the problem is just understanding the effort and how the effort changes, right? So and then we layer in these confounders that heart rate has introduced, right? So we can't really rely on pace because of because of the terrain and the durability component. We can't really rely on heart rate because of the environment that in which we're running, whether it's cool indoors, hot outdoors, shoulder season, all this stuff. And so what I think what we'll see and what we are kind of starting to see with running is that ventilation becomes kind of the power moment for cycling, where finally we have something that we can actually latch onto to understand this is my consistent internal workload, and what I'm targeting to improve my fitness. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, and we're definitely seeing some very interesting things, whether it's from the elite group at Solomon and the triathletes that we work with, on the run portion there and so forth. So, yeah, it's super interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think we need running sort of needs this injection of a new metric. I've actually been running with so I have power meters that I put on my shoes, and obviously those are deriving power, not like directly measuring power. But it's been interesting to sort of train with that and see how that's different compared to my pace. But the ventilation again is something I've been using as well to sort of be a a measure of my output versus pace, which, as you mentioned, just changes based on the terrain you're running in. I'm curious, can you can ventilation be used like the Tymewear device? Could this be used to like estimate calorie burn more accurately than say like heart rate or any other like training metric? I mean, if people, you know, you do a workout, you look at your watch and it's like, oh, you burned 1,200 calories or something, but that's basically just using heart rate as this proxy of my output during that workout. Can ventilation be used in a more accurate way to sort of estimate energy expenditure?
Yeah, I think we'll be able to calibrate it better. You know, a true calorie consumption, let alone where those calories are coming
Hmm.
from, fat versus carbs, you need to measure the O2 and the CO2. Um, and the CO2 component of that is super important there to understand what is actually being burned with respect to fat and carbs. With only O2, you cannot reliably get that. So I think we can improve it. And like for example, a heart rate if it's drifting independent of the internal workload, you're not burning more calories if the ventilation is staying the same. So things like that where we can probably kind of correct for these errors or these what we would in that instance call an error, but in another instance would actually be a great signal that the heart rate is drifting. It's just you don't want to use that to determine your calories
Yep.
burned because it's diverging, right? So I think we can start to sort of course correct these things and make them better. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess in theory, and maybe you all have done some testing, obviously, but the Timeware device has been sort of validated against laboratory measure VO2 max.
Hmm.
Because when I received the device and opened the app, it admittedly, I haven't done this test yet. I haven't done a VO2 max test wearing my Timeware device. It's something I plan on doing, but I'm hesitant to do it because just they're, painful, obviously. But I need to get out on my treadmill or my bike and do one of these some days. So, but if I were to say, calibrate, do a VO2 max test or do a VO2 max test using my Timeware device, the ventilation, I mean, I guess in theory you could get a rough estimation of CO2 production, maybe O2 consumption, and maybe then even almost determine maybe your fat and carbohydrate burn, I guess. I mean, that would require a lot of individual testing, but it's potential, to commercialize that and, people could use this device to sort of help with that. I think that's kind of the area where I see potential utility as well.
So the what the test really does is and we really try to stay away from too many estimations and sort of putting too much guesswork into things like we want to be as true to measurement as we possibly can. And what the test really does is when you know your VT1, VT2, and your VO2 max or an assessment of your max aerobic output, um, that's what the test really gives you. So where you cap out your max 1 minute MAP, max aerobic power pace, versus where your VT1 and VT2 are falling. There's a lot of information in the relationship between your VT1 and VO2 max and your VT2 and VO2 max as it relates to where your training should focus in terms of where you have the lowest hanging fruit to improve. So if your VT1 is coming in at a relatively low percentage of VO2 max, that's a surefire signal that your aerobic foundation, your base, is weak. If it's high, then what it tells us is that you can spend all the time you want in zone two. You're not going to see that move much.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and that the ceiling is really the limiter, right? Your VO2 max needs to be raised up a bit, and you're primed to do so because your foundation is so solid. You're primed to sort of push up that VO2 max with a nice block of a VO2 max block. And so by knowing where those percentages are at a given time, VT1% of VO2 max, VT2% of VO2 max, really sets the foundation for where should I be focusing my training in order to tackle my lowest hanging fruit, in order to improve the most and the most efficiently. That is, we don't need CO2 and O2, carbs, fat to know that, and that's really the foundation of like effective individualized training is where should I be focusing my time in my training, my training volume, uh, in order to make the most improvement. And by tracking that over time as it changes, then we can sort of ebb and flow with our actual changing fitness level to make sure that we are effectively targeting the thing that is going to move the needle the most. So that's the benefit of the test. I recommend doing one. It really kind of it's an underpinning of the insights that the product can provide, and we are it's in beta now, and but we're building a neural net that is learning how to assess the breathing data in conjunction with the heart rate data in order to assess VT1 and VT2 from workouts alone. Because the information is embedded in the signal itself, right? So VT1, if you traverse VT1, it doesn't matter if it's in a workout or a threshold test. The threshold test just makes the environment, the context really clean, and you can just
Yep.
pick it out really cleanly. But if you traverse it in a workout, the signal is still there. It's just harder to pick out. And that's where things like machine learning and neural nets can be really powerful in understanding the underlying pattern or the sort of the relationships and the behavior of how that signal changes to show that you've actually traversed VT1, pick it out of a workout and be able to present it and sort of show this is where your VT1 is. And so that's something that's in beta already right now and in the product, and something that we're sort of transitioning to in terms of not having to take tests, although testing is fundamental, and it just provides a really clean view of the person's fitness level. But yeah, it's something that you have to dedicate, a day to, and if you have a high volume of training, then it's hard to fit that in unless you're sort of in a transition block or something like that. So
Yeah, and that's sort of why I've been maybe planning to do one, because I'm sort of in a not necessarily training for anything. My volume is pretty high, but I have a little bit of time where I can just like set aside to maybe do one of these tests. So I think you've convinced me enough to go out there and try to get my VT1 and VT2. So I'll try to do it sometime in the next couple weeks. I think you've convinced me enough to do it. So if people are interested in this device, say they get a device, want to start using ventilation, where would you suggest that they start? So, consider me, maybe I'm a first time user, I got the strap in the mail, I want to go do a couple workouts. What would you suggest doing right away? What would you suggest maybe not doing, and maybe how not to look at the data? But what are some ways in which people can should start using ventilation kind of right off the bat if they are interested in doing so?
but the happy path is taking your test, getting your results, and then seeing where your metrics are with respect to VT1, VT2, where your actual training zones are, right? Zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's really foundational. And then being able to sort of see, this is where I was training versus this is where my actual fitness level is. That's a huge insight that like a lot of people can have. Sometimes it's similar, sometimes it's very divergent. And then it's starting to play around with, you don't have to, we offer kind of adaptive training. So you get a workout recommendation in the app, and you can play around with the settings and sort of basically create a training plan for yourself and so forth. So all that is great, but I think just to start to get familiar with, like, you get your VT1 VE, and you set up your Garmin with the data field or your Wahoo on the bike, or I think we have a Suunto app now and a Hammerhead. So we're basically like on most of the devices, and set it up so that you just, when you do your zone 2 ride, you know where your VT1 VE is, and just get familiar with it. And see where you are actually, how your ventilation is responding to the workload. Get a feel for that ventilation level. What does the power do? What does the heart rate do? Pace do? And so forth. So you just get a feel for it. And what a lot of people report is that for the first time, a training metric becomes intuitive. It's representing how they feel.
Yep.
which is I think very powerful, and sort of an aha moment for a lot of people, and just it, being able to actually effectively individualize their training and execute workouts in a better way. So yeah, that's where I would start, and then yeah, definitely do some of the workouts, play around with it, set up a training plan and follow it. Do a block, so do 6 weeks of training if you're not already on a training plan. Do 6 weeks of the training, test again, see the results. Is your VT1 moving? Is your VT2 moving? Is your VO2 max improving? Depending on what the focus of that block was, which is all dependent on how you presented, in that first test. Where were your low hanging fruit? Play around with it, have fun with it, and see where it takes you.
Yeah, I love all that advice. I think we're going to provide some sort of discount for people who are listening if they want to get this sensor. I mean, I really highly recommend it because it is, we've been talking about breathing this entire time, but it also, it's a heart rate sensor. So it's a dual heart rate sensor. Everybody should have a heart rate monitor. Everybody then should have also this ventilation sensor. So you're getting two in one. Before we go, I do feel like I didn't really even ask you to describe like how the device works. Like how are we measuring ventilation? We have this sensor on the back of the device, but how the heck is it? How is it measuring my metabolic power output? During exercise. I'd like you to describe that before we kind of hop off here, just so people kind of know what's going on with the device.
Yeah, so the sensor is it's effectively a strain gauge, and it's measuring the expansion and contraction of the chest cavity. So as we breathe in and out, uh, the um, the sensor expands and contracts, and we measure that very precisely. So the sensitivity is less than a millimeter in terms of the ability to track that expansion and contraction. The fundamental principle to understand there is that air is incompressible. So the amount of air we breathe in and the space and the circumference change we create with our chest cavity in order to accommodate that air is a near one-to-one mapping. And that's why we can use a relatively simple sensor like a strain gauge, although the complexity is embedded in
Mhm.
all the stuff underlying there. But the principle can be relatively simple to get a very accurate measurement of the airflow in and out. And it was one of the fundamental kind of hypotheses that we had in the beginning. It was like, well, this should be possible, and really our whole development process has been uncovering how to make it possible in the real world. And that's what you have there showing there is the results of that work. So the breathing rate, for instance, is less than 1 breath per minute difference if you had compared to if you have a face mask on and measuring. In the minute ventilation is 97% correlated. So we are not measuring directly the airflow, meaning like
Mhm.
we're not measuring the air, we are measuring the expansion of the chest, which is then really a circumference change. But then that correlates 97% when we look at the actual airflow versus the circumference change and the breathing rate together. That correlates 97% for biking and running. So it's a highly it's a highly accurate device with respect to what you would get from a metabolic output, a metabolic cart, sorry. But importantly, we are not measuring O2 or CO2. Like that's just fundamental. That's not what we're measuring. We're measuring we're measuring the airflow in and out of the lungs, and that is what exposes the ventilatory thresholds. That is what it allows us to use ventilation as a real time intensity control or guide in real time because of that link between CO2 and ventilation. That's that that's why all that works. The more CO2 we produce, the more ventilate. The more we need to ventilate, and that's a very stable relationship. So those are kind of the fundamental principles by which the device works.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love the technology is so cool. The fact that we can measure this stuff and just buy a device to have at home and use every single day. I'm like loving it. I've loved playing around with it for the last few months. So yeah, I think where can people, find you, Arnar? I appreciate you chatting with me today. As I mentioned, people can obviously go to Is it just Tymewear.com if they want to actually find information about the device? Are you on social media anywhere? Are you talking about this stuff elsewhere? Because, I think it's fun to hear how you think about this stuff, especially given your background, maybe not necessarily in like exercise, but then you came over to this and like are now obviously a huge advocate and huge nerd of all this stuff, as am I. But are you posting about this stuff anywhere else?
I am not personally. We have an excellent Instagram account, and I recommend people to follow us there. And as I think we're doing a lot of great stuff there. Just providing information and sharing how people are using it and so forth. So follow us on Instagram at Tymewear, and then our website has all the information you would need, references and how it works and uh, and then I think, there's a number of other podcasts and other people talking about it. So yeah, I think if you just Google it, you'll probably find a bunch of other references and resources to learn more. And um, yeah, that's
Cool. Yeah,
that's
I'll link
what.
some stuff in the notes for this episode. But yeah, Arnar, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun chatting.
No,
Especially since it's something I've been using. I think it's renewed my interest in doing these tests and continuing to use this thing and learn more about it. It's been a learning process because obviously, like most athletes, I've just used heart rate essentially, my entire training career, and now it's this new metric that I'm being introduced to, but it's been helpful so far, and I'm interested in continuing to train with it. Ventilation, it's been a lot of fun.
thanks for having me, Brady, and I really appreciate the time.